Hello and welcome to your Wednesday evening weirding session. I'm your host, C. Savory, creator of Fractal Praxis. I'm looking forward to talking about what I've learned, the content of Fractal Praxis, its lineages, logic, and practical implications. But before we get there, I think we really have to situate ourselves in a process. The process of worldview development and evolution. If you're familiar with Fractal Praxis, you've probably already heard me talk about cognitive structures, which is a technical term, also known as worldviews, mental models, mental maps, etc. A person's worldview is what they take to be true. A worldview is developed over the course of an organism's lifespan. To me, my worldview feels firm and reliable. It feels like it is the sum of everything I've ever dealt with and learned. So to me, it might seem fixed. It might seem correct. It might seem static. Seeing that it protects my ego and my being, I may even feel highly identified with it. That threatening it feels like a threat to my life. Most people don't think about a worldview as an evolutionary phenomena. A worldview literally helps you navigate your environment, survive, reproduce, and thrive, avoid threats, and seize opportunities. Or it's designed to do that. Whether it provides an actual survival advantage or not is dependent on many variables. Most people, though, don't think about how your worldview, your mental model of the world, is actually a living, flexible structure. It arises from inputs, and the meaning made from those inputs is dynamic and fungible. And just like your body, it is subject to evolution. That your belief system and your operational model of the world is by design temporary, subject to change. This is one of the main ideas in Fractal Praxis. It is core to the notion of how we could actually change and evolve into a better situation for ourselves, individually, collectively, or even at the scale of a planetary human society. Let me share with you a story of worldview evolution from my own life, one story of many, and how I specifically learned that it was possible to learn generalized principles from life itself. This is one of the insights that became the core of Fractal Praxis in a way that irreversibly shaped my life's path. When I was 21 years old and about to graduate from a 4-year bachelor's degree in film and video production, I designed my senior thesis project to be a documentary series called the Sustainable Project. For 3 months, I was going to try to live a 100% sustainable lifestyle, which I defined at the time as consuming just one Earth's worth of resources per the environmental footprint calculator. At the time, the average American's lifestyle was estimated to consume 5 Earth's worth of resources, and I wanted to get my footprint down to just 1. I would continue living in Pittsburgh, PA, and attending college, but I would radically restructure my lifestyle to ensure a sustainable level of resource consumption. This would affect every aspect of my life, from housing to transportation to food, water, energy use, etc. At the time, this was my creative opus, and I was completely committed to it. So for 3 months, I carried out this embodied experiment, putting my body on the line for my beliefs about sustainability, which as a young activist and nascent anarchist is something I'd already gained experience doing. But what I found is the world pushed back in a big way. While I achieved some limited success in my goals during that period, I had a really honestly traumatic experiences unfold across those 3 months. I lost important relationships, my housing situation collapsed, and my mental and physical health declined significantly because of the strains involved in the project. This profoundly challenged my assumptions about sustainability that I had been such a gung-ho believer for at the start of the project. You see, I had tested my original firm, rigid beliefs about sustainability on my own body. And so my body was the site of the challenges, the feedback, the dissolution, and the learnings resulting from this lifestyle experiment. Of course, I felt the shame and humiliation of my initial ideals and my valiant aims shattering in front of the witness of my peers and community. But I never could quite let go of the original inquiry. I was still interested in, well, if this wasn't sustainable and didn't add up to achieving sustainability, what would? Over the course of the next couple years, I engaged in deep and painful reflection about what went wrong. I did a lot of journaling, traveling, healing, sitting with my anguish and my broken aspirations. In that period, I began to make sense of what my lived experiences had shown me about what sustainability was not. I could begin to see the rampant individualism and white saviorism in the constructs of the project. I could see the narrow definition of sustainability in terms of resources, rather than interrogating the systems, lifestyles, and culture producing our problems of sustainability in the first place. I could see that I was missing something in my original definition of sustainability, if the project's ideals were in reality so damaging and, yes, unsustainable to my actual life. I was in a deep, dark night of the soul, as it's known, grappling with my own ignorance, having been confronted so viscerally through my valorous lived experience experiment about what I believed was not only so true, but was going to save us. I had a lot to unpack. Eventually, I had healed enough and recouped enough of my energy to be ready for the next chapter. I knew I wanted to do something with my story, some deeper cinematic documentary inquiry into the contended meanings of sustainability, the meanings, plural, of sustainability, presenting diverse perspectives and expanding the inquiry beyond achieving so-called 100% sustainability to what does sustainability even mean? And so it was April 2010, about 2 years after launching the initial Sustainable project, that I found myself holding a printed academic article from the field of cybernetics entitled something like Foundations of Sustainable Systems, to start to see what this scholarly discourse had to say about the meaning of sustainability in the field of dynamic systems. By the end of the first section of the article, my jaw had dropped. By the second section, I had begun pacing my room and chanting, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," under my breath to myself. By the final section of the article, I had fully crumpled to the floor and was crying. Why? Because what I had found articulated in this article, I already knew. I knew these principles of sustainable systems in general. I had come to know them already through the process of critiquing the many consequential failures of that first sustainable project, mostly as lived through my body and the shattering of my initial worldview. The abject wonder that overcame me then, and this ineffable sense of unity with everything, I find it hard to describe. But the question that then came to mind was, how could I know? How could I already have known this? And that became a type of governing inquiry that would shape the rest of my life's path. I somehow had found and harvested universal principles about sustainable systems in general, despite my initial ignorance to sustainability. Through my commitment to understanding what went wrong, I had somehow indeed learned these principles. The structure of the lived experience lifestyle experiment that I had built perhaps made this possible, because I started out to live a fully sustainable lifestyle and I could not, which made me question the whole construct. Coming to realize that perhaps there was a universal nature of sustainability, but that most of our discourses didn't even get close to it, and that we'd have to do a lot of unraveling of our standard worldviews before we could even approach an understanding of sustainability like in the ways that indigenous cultures perhaps had. This became my motivation to creating the next film project called Sustainable: The Metamentary. The metamentary would deliberately push cinematic boundaries to try to tell an evolving narrative, one mirroring the mind-warping journey required to really grapple with what it would mean to achieve sustainability. The awe and connection to everything I felt in the aftermath of reading that article, April 2010, was just the beginning of my liberation into the wisdom attainable through intimate study and carefully constructed experiments of lived experience and of trying to understand what is true from lived experience. It was my first major encounter with reality as teacher, which deepened my resolve at the time to abandon any further pursuit of traditional schooling and social achievement whatsoever from that point on, and instead launch myself into an intensive and rigorous pursuit of knowledge directly, gnostically, you might even say, through relating with my lived experiences, processing them in certain ways, relating with my own emergent wonder and intuition in reality, and building those thoughtful experiments to test the bounds of what I could know and of the meaning I was assigning to things. So when I'm sharing Fractal Praxis, it is a worldview, yes, but it is a worldview that has undergone and evolved as a result of, I would estimate, more than a dozen, perhaps roughly 20, massive internal reorganizing events like the story I just described. Under deliberate pressure, Fractal Praxis has been compelled to integrate information and insight from across a wide range of disciplines, from secular scientific theories to religious and spiritual understandings and experiences, to indigenous and anarchist worldviews that transcend the imposing logic of Western colonial capitalism, dualism, etc. Given all this invisible labor accumulated into the worldview I'm now presenting, I might even be so bold as to claim that Fractal Praxis is approaching a grand unified theory. Of course, the theory, and such a claim too, is subject to evolution. When I say my worldview, Fractal Praxis, has undergone major restructurings, I mean I have personally undergone these extreme change events. The anecdote I shared is just one of several major breakthrough events that occurred for me in relatively short succession in my early to mid 20s. If you have not had this kind of thing happen to you, if, in other words, your sense of self has remained relatively intact and only been kind of built upon over the course of your life, then I ask you to just imagine your whole way of seeing things, your story of self, your story of the world, your construct of what everything means, gets torn asunder, shattered into a million pieces. And you, for that moment, are completely rudderless. Everything you thought meant something might mean as little as nothing. The events of this unraveling might be kind of slow processes, or they can also be catastrophic, spontaneous, transcendental events, but are often preceded or followed by literally years-long suffering periods of depression and anxiety rooted in the body-mind's meaning-making efforts. Surely this is an intense way to choose to live one's life. The payoff of a more holistic, effective, and elegant worldview is obviously quite high, but the toll paid to arrive there, to break through our ordinary consciousness, is often brutal. It is the temporary loss of a sense of self, a total loss of orientation and meaning even. Here's another example from my life. My first spontaneous spiritual peak experience occurred to me at age 23, and it made the entire 23 years of my life up to that point feel like a dream. And that experience was as if it was the only true thing I had ever encountered. How do you bounce back from something like that without any religious grounding at all? Which in my case was true. Indeed, previously, up to that moment, I would have identified as something like a humanist atheist, scientific humanist atheist. So we're talking major integration events. Most of us would reasonably fear a loss of that magnitude like we would fear losing our own lives. But I'm here to report from the other side that these losses of self, importantly, are not a loss of life. In a way, they are an initiation back into life as a process, living life as a process, one that does not cease when ideas or strategies fail circumstantially or locally. When you can access a life that transcends your ordinary worldview and assumptions, no matter how coveted those assumptions, then you will be initiated in the ways I have been. Fortunately, I grew to understand this process and the mechanisms behind self-loss and how we gain stronger cognitive structures. I began to see it as a process and feel that it was an overall trustworthy process. I began to learn that I could lean into this process, and that even as harrowing as the total loss of meaning might seem, I could be relatively safe so long as I put my faith in the process and practiced attunement, self-kindness, and patience. As a result, this meta process, so intense that most of us avoided our whole lives, became as accessible to me as something like physical exercise. To develop a stronger and more flexible mind is somewhat like developing muscles, sometimes by tearing them. Most ideas that we kind of just absorb and take to be true in our process of conditioning are flimsy and are made to be reorganized into higher order structures. Indeed, I argue that this is the premise and the praxis of life itself. However, Other ideas have so much explanatory power that they render the rest of the world intelligible. In my early 20s, I came across a few ideas that possess, in my view, a great deal of explanatory power, which is something I'll go into in a later episode. For example, my study of sustainability brought me into awareness of systems thinking. And systems thinking is a framework that makes everything else in the world make so much more sense. So these handful of ideas, internalized in my early 20s, have actually managed to weather and withstand all of the subsequent transformations. They continue to form a philosophical foundation, or pillars, underpinning fractal praxis. And for the next few episodes, I will be attempting to unpack some of these pillars, from Occam's razor to syntropy and planetary change praxis, a la Buckminster Fuller, to how consciousness develops through recursion, Douglas Hofstadter, to the universal phenomenon of cognition broadly defined in all living organisms, Maturana and Varela. And this will be my effort to start to get to the what, the root beliefs upon which the rest of Fractal Praxis's original thinking will be elaborated. And what I want to leave you with is the power of these transformation processes in providing us with hope in these times. I want you to feel that these processes are trustworthy too. I want you to see how important this is for evolving into individuals and communities that are more capable of being here well, of being more fit to the requirements of the actual world, of life itself, not our projections about it. The world is constantly giving us feedback about what is, but if we're not attuned and oriented to processing this feedback arising from our lived experiences, we are missing out on a whole lot of wisdom. We are missing out on opportunities to more deeply relate to the rest of life, and we're missing out on opportunities to develop autonomy and forge original, independent worldviews through harboring a direct, vibrant relationship with life rather than simply accepting the conditioning we inherit or are exposed to. There is a way to learn generalized principles directly from life through engagement and meaning making. You can process your lived experiences in ways that let you harvest more generalized universal truths from the particular details you encounter, that equip you with knowledge to become more sovereign, aware, and skillful in your interactions with the rest of the entire world. These are radical claims, and I'm going to be backing them up. I seek to radicalize you into more aware, sensitive, and intentional relationship with reality as processed through your own life. Because here is a promise that you can and will become more sovereign, more fully intelligent, more sensitive, and more powerful through a direct path, through your own hard work to evolve into who you must become through this life. This is a path of hope. Hope for becoming reorganized by life and your own intrinsic intelligence. Hope for being able to go beyond the worldview and story of self you've inherited and been conditioned to believe in. Hope for a transcendent, living, breathing process that welcomes you into reunification with nature beyond stories of self. Hope for forging a new culture grounded in direct and shared understandings, to go beyond the inherited culture which causes and reinforces the systemic problems and predicaments we grapple with today. Hope for a path to deeper autonomy, going beyond conditioned self, beyond influence of any brainwashing even, into a rigorous sense-making process-based relationship with life directly, giving you direct wisdom and growth material. Hope for the courage to recognize that no matter how well reinforced like a castle wall that it might be, There is no rational argument, no worldview whatsoever that makes you fully safe in this world. That instead, you must take responsibility for the results your worldview is getting you in this life, and that becoming a correct person might be transcended by becoming a whole person, adaptive, intelligent, and re-embedded in fulfilling relationship with all aspects of life. A framing inquiry for my work, since even before the Sustainable Project at age 21, is how do we get right with life? How do we be here well? How do we do good? How do we make good of our lives? How do we fulfill on these precious lives through inhabiting them fully and increasing the goodness available to all? And can we do it ourselves? No external authority nor even a mythos needed? How do we get so here in our own lives that we become exceptionally functional, beneficial, beautiful, and fearless? When we can take total responsibility for the results we get from the world and for the patterns that people come to know us by? When our minds become so exquisitely powerful as to be able to parse the patterns and devise effective interventions in even the most dense, entangled, heart-rending messes of life? When we become warriors of going to our own edges and integrating them? I believe all of this is attainable, if not accessible, to us through digesting direct experience for the truth, leaning into an intrinsic process that is in fact home for all living beings, learning. That we can grow and evolve more adaptive worldviews. This is a type of liberation. It tangibly reduces the friction in our lives. It makes our interactions and relationships more beneficial in general. It allows us to operate with the elegance of beliefs that hold great explanatory power and release non-conducive beliefs systematically. It allows us to target and embody effective interventions that make the world more beautiful, skillfully. It is hard not to reduce the irreducible, not to bypass the true and take comfort in the shallow, but it is possible to train our worldviews this way, and it is highly rewarding, evolutionarily speaking, and personally and spiritually. All sentient beings can access this path, and I intend my particular life be put forth as an example of this process, not an end outcome. That is to say, I'm not intending to be a guru, although I think my worldview has many merits. Rather, from this point on, I'm aiming to show my work, to be a whole proof, a comprehensive demonstration. But it wouldn't be a win to me if you merely thought what I thought. Instead, what I want for you is to embrace these processes for your own liberation. The process you use to get to greater meaning is yours to acquire and to move through. It is this process that will liberate us, which is why Praxis is right there in the title of this work. Not dogma, praxis. Arrive where you need to be yourself. Make the meaning. Don't believe as I believe. Believe what works for you to believe and test it, thus developing an original worldview as only you can. If you become this person, and if we become this people, I believe all we touch will be transformed.